Today I'd like to address the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. In a nutshell, the argument is that the laws and constants which describe our universe, and which allow life to exist within it, are so improbable that the best explanation must be some kind of designer. For this video, I'd like to put aside the broader question of how we detect design in general. This will be the topic of a future video. For now, I'd like to focus on life and the universe and what we know about them. With that understood, here's a collection of Christians making the fine-tuning argument.
Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. Consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting.
Earth has been hung in precisely the right location to receive all the elements that are essential for life. Even though the stars in our galaxy are as numerous as the grains of sand on this beach, namely about 100 billion, many astronomers are now convinced that it's extremely unlikely that there could be another habitable planet anywhere among them.
Premise 1. The probability that our universe would be life-permitting given naturalism is very, very low. Premise 2. The probability that our universe would be life-permitting given theism is not very, very low. So, it follows the fact that our universe is life-permitting provides evidence for theism over naturalism. So the fact that our universe permits the evolution of embodied conscious creatures is actually pretty puzzling. Imagine for a moment that there was no such thing as gravity. Do you think that people like us, or any creatures at all, could evolve in such a universe? The answer is no. There wouldn't even be planets. Matter would just kind of be floating around everywhere. There'd be no stars, no atmospheres, nothing at all resembling what we see here in our universe. So not only do we need a universal attractive force like gravity, it has to be set at the exact right strength. Physicists have estimated that the gravitational constant is fine-tuned to 60 decimal places. Any deviation on either side of that would result in a lifeless universe.
As you can see, this argument can be phrased in several different ways. It can range from a simple observation about the numerical probability of some seemingly necessary feature of the universe, or it can be phrased as a formal argument of inference to the best explanation. Here's how I would phrase the formal argument presented by Capturing Christianity. Now, regardless of the exact form, this argument is very intuitive, and I often see people struggling to explain what exactly is wrong with it. To date, I have yet to find a refutation that I think is truly exhaustive. So, what is wrong with this argument? Well, it's not just one thing. It's more like 6 things. The first question that comes to my mind is, well, what do you mean by theism? Do you mean Christianity specifically, monotheism in general, or can we go all the way out to polytheism? Does that count? This gets into the first problem with the fine-tuning argument, which I'm going to call the theological problem. If by theism you mean the Christian God, in a world where Christianity is therefore true, well then the probability of having a life-permitting universe would be 1, because Christianity specifically says that God created the heavens, the earth, and life. I can only hope that very few Christians would define theism in this way, but some might, so I'm calling it out now. This does highlight a problem we'll explore later in this video. You could invent all sorts of ad hoc explanations that, if true, would make the evidence we see highly probable. But so what? Now, if by theism you just mean some kind of generic theism with no specific God in mind, well then, it's basically impossible to gauge the probability of a life-permitting universe, since there is an infinite number of theistic gods which could exist, either individually or at the same time, many of which could have absolutely no desire to create universes, much less life. I mean, how would you even begin to estimate the number of theistic gods who would create our universe compared to those who wouldn't? I don't think you can. And I think this highlights a hidden assumption within the original argument. The fine-tuning argument assumes that theistic beings would generally want to create life-permitting universes. This seems like a pretty bold assumption, but it is one that Christians do try to support, as we'll see in a minute. And finally, if by theism you mean a Christian-type God who is infinite and all-powerful, but who isn't necessarily the Christian God, then we can at least start the conversation. So, what is the probability that an infinite, perfect being would create a universe like ours? Well, Christians will argue that the probability is very high, but I would argue that it's actually closer to 0. After all, why would an infinite, perfect being create anything? Why would it do anything? Is it not perfect already on its own? To be perfect would seem to imply wanting for nothing. And this is a theological problem that I've heard Christians discuss amongst themselves. But for some reason, this problem seems to vanish as soon as they trot out the fine-tuning argument. Oh, God would totally create a universe like ours. Trust me, I know God. Quite frankly, I find arguments like these fascinating. Here's just one example.
So that's the kind of formally how you get the improbability under chance, then the of this life-permitting universe occurring, then how you get the probability under theism, and you can't get an exact probability, is you appeal to God's goodness. That's what's underlying it. You perceive there's some value in embodied conscious agents. And since God is perfectly good, a perfectly good being, its motivation for acting in one way over another is whether acting in one way is better than acting in another. So the perfectly good being is motivated by creating things that realize value. And so if you perceive a value in there being embodied conscious beings, then that's going to give God, you're going to think God is going to have a good reason to create such beings because God creates in accordance with value. So that's how you get the that it's at least not super improbable under theism.
The reason I find this fascinating is because when non-Christians do the same thing in order to show that the Christian God is not in fact compatible with our universe, like when they point out how inhospitable most of the universe is to life, or when they explain the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness, many Christians will declare that it's arrogant and foolish to pretend to understand God and to make inferences based on his nature. God is not a subject to be put into a petri dish. But for some reason, it's okay when they do it. It's okay when they try to infer what an infinite, perfect being would do, such as creating a universe. So that's what I call the theological problem. It's a question of what kind of theism you're referring to, and it highlights the problems that arise when you start making inferences based on the properties of undefined gods. Next, I'd like to talk about probability exclusively in the second problem with the fine-tuning argument. As it turns out, the formal phrasing of the argument, whether my own phrasing or capturing Christianity's phrasing, is actually an example of what's called the Prosecutor's fallacy. This is when a person assumes that the probability of A given B is the same as the probability of B given A, which is not true. This might sound unintuitive, but we can demonstrate this fallacy in the real world. Let's say I roll a die, and it happens to land on 4. Now, consider this. What is the probability that the die landed on 4 in a world where I have telekinesis, compared to a world in which I don't have telekinesis? Well, if I do have telekinesis, then the probability of having rolled a 4 could be as high as 1. But if I don't have telekinesis, then the probability of having rolled a 4 is only 0.16. Therefore, I probably have telekinesis? I think you can see the problem. Coming across something after the fact, and then proposing a framework in which that thing was highly probable, doesn't actually prove that the proposed framework is correct.
Sit! I said sit! Take a walk. Sniff that other dog's butt. See? He does exactly what I tell him.
The probability of 4 given telekinesis is not the same as the probability of telekinesis given 4. And in this case, 4 is our given. Applying this knowledge to the formal fine-tuning argument, we would say that the probability of life given God is not equal to the probability of God given life. Even if we agreed that a Christian-type God probably would create life, that tells us nothing about the probability of such a God existing, given the fact that life exists. The argument from probability already fails with no need to go further. It's a simple case of the prosecutor's fallacy. The probability of A given B is not the same as the probability of B given A. But let's go further anyway, because it's even worse than that. In the example of rolling a 4, it might have occurred to you to ask, well, what if I had predicted rolling a 4? What if I predicted it 100 times in a row? Wouldn't that prove my telekinesis? Well, maybe, although trick dice do exist. So in this situation, you'd probably want a wider variety of specific predictions, not just limited to dice. And even then, we would have to be very careful about what we identify as a prediction. I was once dealt a full house in poker, and I was amazed. Wow, what are the odds? A full house on the deal. But then I realized that I wasn't actually amazed by my full house per se. I would have been amazed by any better-than-average hand with its own unique name. Straight flush, royal straight flush, full house, 4 of a kind. The chance of being dealt any of those hands is not nearly as remote as the chance of being dealt a specific one of them. Without realizing it, I had zeroed in on the one hand I was dealt, to the exclusion of all others, in constructing my probability model, which had the effect of artificially inflating my sense of improbability. The lesson here is that being dealt any particular hand is very unlikely, but that doesn't mean that every hand is a miracle, even if it has some special significance that you recognize after the fact. Now, if I had predicted my full house, that would be rather more compelling and improbable.
Deal, Data.
But no one has bet.
Forget the bet, just deal. 10. 7. Queen.
9. Jack. 4.
Deuce. 6. This is highly improbable.
Indeed, this is what makes scientific theories so powerful. It's not just the fact that they can explain things, it's their predictive power that makes them shine. But I didn't predict my full house, and we didn't predict this particular type of universe with this particular type of life. We would have been impressed by any life in any type of universe, no matter how well or how poorly the two fit together. And as we'll see later, the fit we have isn't actually that impressive. But that's not even the real problem with the statistics of the fine-tuning argument. The real problem is not our lack of prediction, it's the fact that we don't even know the probabilities in the first place. As we saw at the beginning of this video, the fine-tuning argument can be presented as a comparison of probabilities, arranged in a formal structure. We've already addressed premise 2 when we explored the theological problem. The probability that a theistic God would create a life-permitting universe is by no means clear, and I've argued that it could indeed be very low. But the flip side of that coin, premise 1, should also be addressed. Is the probability of life given naturalism, or simply not theism, in fact, very low, as Capturing Christianity has asserted? Well, that's the thing. We don't actually know how likely a life-permitting universe is in a non-theistic model, because we don't have an explanation of the universe whose probability we can gauge in the first place. We have no idea how, if at all, the physics of our universe could be changed, or what other types of life could exist in these hypothetical other universes, let alone in our own.
It is certainly true that if you change the parameters of nature, our local conditions that we observe around us would change by a lot. I grant that quickly. I do not grant that therefore life could not exist. I will start granting that once someone tells me the conditions under which life can exist. What is the definition of life, for example? If it's just information processing, thinking, or something like that, there's a huge panoply of possibilities. They sound very science fiction-y, but then again, you're the one who's changing the parameters of the universe. The results are going to sound like they come from a science fiction novel. Sadly, we just don't know whether life could exist if the conditions of our universe were very different, because we only see the universe that we see.
For all we know, the probability of this particular universe could be as high as 1. There may be no other possible universes. In fact, we don't even know if the other imagined values for the various constants are all equally likely. It may be the case that the constants we have each fall in the middle of a very narrow normal distribution, and are thus extremely likely. What this means is that the fine-tuning argument cannot be a comparison of probabilities between theism and naturalism. It's a comparison of probabilities between theism and I don't know. How likely is our universe under the I don't know model compared to a theistic model? Yeah, exactly. I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows. It's a completely nonsensical comparison. You might as well ask someone how likely it was that you rolled a 6 on a die, thus winning you a game of chance, without that person knowing how many other faces there are on the die, or how many other ways there might be to win the game. You can't gauge the probability of a framework that you don't have. Christians who make the fine-tuning argument seem to take the atheist statement of, I don't know why the universe is the way it is, and then twist it into, I think the universe is the way it is because of chance, which then allows the Christian to assert that this chance must be very low. This is false and dishonest. To return to our card game analogy, the fine-tuning argument relies on the audience being amazed at having been dealt a full house, without any understanding of how big the deck is, what other cards exist in the deck, how the deal was actually conducted, or how many other good hands exist in the game. The apologist then asserts, with no evidence, that the deck must have been full of jokers, and that, by the grace of God, we miraculously drew the only winning hand. However, that's not to say that we don't at least know some of the probabilities. In the cases where we do have a framework for calculating the odds are actually pretty good. For example, you may have heard the argument that the expansion rate of the universe, which is described by the cosmological constant, must have been finely tuned.
Consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly, or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting.
But as it turns out, no fine-tuning is required, as physicist Sean Carroll explained to William Lane Craig.
The fine-tunings that you think are there might go away once you understand the universe better. They might only be apparent. There's a famous example that theists like to give, or even cosmologists who haven't thought about it enough, that the expansion rate of the early universe is tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 60th. That's the naive estimate back of the envelope, pencil, and paper you would do. But in this case, you can do better. You can go into the equations of general relativity, and there is a correct, rigorous derivation of the probability. And when you ask the same question using the correct equations, you find that the probability is 1. All but a set of measure 0 of early universe cosmologies have the right expansion rate to live for a long time and allow life to exist. I can't say that all parameters fit into that paradigm, but until we know the answer, we can't claim that they are definitely finely tuned.
Many great advances in our understanding about the world began with the statement, I don't know, or I can't explain this. However, the answers were not discovered by comparing the probability of it was caused by random chance to all other imagined explanations. Why not? Well, because for any given mystery about the world, call it X, I could propose fairies whose sole purpose was to make X happen, and then they disappeared. Well, would you look at that? X is 100% likely under the fairy model. Therefore, fairies exist? Now, I can certainly grant that phenomenon X may feel unlikely under naturalism, but that's been the case ever since science began. How do the stars know where to be year after year? Why does every oak tree make acorns and not pine cones? I mean, what are the odds? Clearly, this is the wrong way to reason about the world. For all these reasons, the fine-tuning argument has a massive statistical problem, many aspects of which are predicated on twisting the statement, "I don't know," into "it was chance," and then asserting that this chance must be very low for some reason. This leads us into the third problem with the fine-tuning argument. The entire fine-tuning argument rests on a form of argument from ignorance, or God of the gaps. At its core, the fine-tuning argument asserts that because we don't know of any natural explanation, therefore the probability of a natural process doing it must be very low, whereas the probability of God made it that way is very high. Therefore, God probably made it that way.
That just sounds like
God of the gaps
with extra steps.
You could make this same type of fallacious argument about the formation of our planet before we understood gravity. We don't know of any naturalistic explanation for our planet. Therefore, the probability of it just happened by chance must be very low. I mean, of all the possible shapes, what are the odds that it would be a sphere? But the probability of God doing it is not very low. Therefore, God made the earth. All you've done is taken a God of the gaps argument and dressed it up in softer terms. That's it for part 1. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss part 2.